Okay. I hope that's, yeah. Sorry, the summary, you'll have to listen for the summary. You'll have to listen to the previous shear or read the Kitzer. But we just did the summary and I forgot to put on the record button. So, Perek Lamed. um, Perek Lamed starts on Daf Samach Daled in the new version and Daf Mem Tes in the old version. So, Lamed. While Shnei Madregas are null, in other words, the first two Madregas, the Madrega of the sefiros hegenuzos is b'ma'atzilan before the Tzimtzum, and the Inyan of the sefiros blima. While Shnei Madregas are null, ne'emar hamelech hamerimam levado me'az, v'hamisnasei mimos oilam. There's two Madregas, hamelech hamerimam levadoi, and the Inyan of hamisnasei mimos oilam. These are two different Madregas. The first Madrega is going to explain is the Inyan of the sefiros hegenuzos, merimam levadoi, and the Inyan of misnasei mimos oilam is the Inyan of sefiros blima. And we'll get to the third Madrega soon. The Pirush Hamelech Merumam Hu Shemerumam Munusa Be'etzem. It's not a comparative merumam, a comparative menusa, meaning muvdal and elevated above something else. In other words, a comparative elevation, compared, let's say, to the ohros of Atzilus. No, the merumam over here and the menusa is be'etzem. In other words, it's not shaykh to oilam klal, as he just says. She'enu shaykh to oilam klal. It's not shaykh to other sefiros, not shaykh to any comparison. It's merumam mitoch atzmai. V'zehu levado. That's why it's called levado. Bechinas hu levado hu ve'en zulasoi. Ukmo v'niskav havaya v'niskav Hashem levado. Ukmoi atahu havaya levadecho. Ukmo shekaz b'makom acher. Now, why he brings different psukim to prove the point? One pasuk would have been enough, or one nusach tefillah would have been enough, but nevertheless, he brings all three psukim, mistoma, to highlight different inyonim in the inyan of the achdus of the ohros in the Or Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum. But without the Rebbe Rashab going into it here by Arichos, I'm not going to speculate as to what his intentions were in bringing all three psukim, but Mastoma, there were intentions. So he goes on to say, what is this inyan of merumam? V'hainu b'chinas malchus ta'ein sof k'mo shehu livnei hatzimtzum. These madregas where there's esa sefiros, is the esa ohros in malchus ta'ein sof before the tzimtzum. In other words, in Malchus of Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum is the tziur of ohros. Even though the ohros are not divided one from the other, nevertheless, the ohros have a tziur. Shezeu bechinas, what's this tziur? Shezeu bechinas ha'ash'ora shebor Ein Sof ha'bligul. Shir ba'atzma b'koyach masha asid liyos b'poil. Shir ba'atzma, that's the inyan of the sefiros hegenuzos. That's the inyan, the hash'ora, this hash'ora is the inyan of the hagbolos ha'oir. In other words, that there's eser sefiros hegenuzos in Malchus the Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum, but nevertheless they're not divided off from one another. So it's bechinas hashora shebor Ein Sof habligul lahoyir bechinas gvul. So it's hashora in the bligvul, how be meir in the gvul. Now you could explain this, and he has brought this moshel before, and he'll bring it soon as well. It's the moshel of the difference between machshova and dibur, and certainly the difference between machshova and maisa. In machshova, the inyonim may have a tziur, but it's not a tziur b'poil mamish. It's a tziur machshavti. It's a tziur in seichel. It's not a tziur in the words. It's not chitul ha'oisius of the words themselves. In other words, when we speak out the words, each word prevents the other one from being spoken. When you're saying one word, you can't say another word at the same time, otherwise it's completely unintelligible. Therefore, the words come in a serial fashion, one after the other. Masha'en kain, inyonim in machshova, as they are in machshova, since they're on a much higher madrega, all the inyonim come together, so to speak. Yes, they can be divided out if we theoretically do some kind of analysis in what's going in the theory of inyonim as they are in machshava, but nevertheless, the standard inyan is, for example, the inyan of re'iyah, like an image. A certain image can be expanded, it can be explained, and so on, but the image is seen as one composite image, and that's the way that the oyres are in the Or Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum, in Malchus the Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum. But nevertheless, there's a tziyur to that re'iyah. In other words, there's an object, so to speak, that is being seen. There's no, well, let's not put it that way. There's not an object that's being seen, but the vision itself has a certain tziyur. Okay, so that's the inyan of the hashora of the Or Ein Sof habligvul before the tzimtzum. And the intention of this is that later on, these inyonim will come out later on b'gvul. Laha'ir b'b'chinas gvul. But as they are in the Or Ein Sof habligvul, in Malchus the Ein Sof, hein ha'eses sefiros hegenuzos. That's the eses sefiros hegenuzos. So that's the first madrega that we spoke about. The second madrega we'll get to shortly. כמו שכזה אין נסבור לאל פרק חוב זין. לבחינת המדרגה זו, היא תכלס הייחוד והיסקלולוס באור אין סוף. This is the stage at which we say hu levadoi, niskav havaya levadoi, etc. B'chinas tachlis hayichud v'yiskalulus b'orein sof. V'lo b'chushban eses sefiros adayin kanal perechov tes. And you can't call them exactly the cheshbon of eses sefiros, even though they're called the eses sefiros hegenuzos, but the eses sefiros which are not yet individuated. They're not individualized yet. They eses sefiros in the sense that they are, no question about it, they are definitely a tziyur in the or, which can be called eses sefiros, but they're not individual sefiros in the sense of chokhmah, bina, and so on and so forth, as we'll see. V'alkein harazeh b'chinas roimemus v'hisnasus legamrei chulu. V'hainu b'chinas hisnasus atzmi. It's not just hisnasus, but it's nasus atzmi, because there's two forms of hisnasus. One is hisnasus, like for instance, a melech is misnase al am, in the sense that ein melech below am. If there's no am, there's no melech. But here we're talking about the inner melech metoch atzmi, even if there's no am. And as yet, at this stage in time, there's no am, right? There's no inyan of nifrodim at this point. And therefore, he's misnase ba'atzmoi and not misnase over something. Okay? So, Hani B'chinis is misnase atzmi, the ma'ach she'enu B'chinis makor adayin, since this is not an inyan of a makor as yet, it's not a makor for what will be later on. It's not a makor because a makor is already shaykh to the inyan of oilemus. This is not yet shaykh to the inyan of oilemus. Ein b'chinas makor adayin. Memela haraz b'chinas hisnasus atzmi. It's hisnasus atzmi and not hisnasus al dvarim acherim. V'agam shezehu hashora. But even though we said that it's hisnasus atzmi, and there's an inyan of hashora laha'ir b'midu gvul, and the whole intention of the hashora, the measuring out in himself what's going to be in the future, right? That is a hagbola in some way or another in the or. It's a tziyur in the or. There's a hashora in the or. And nevertheless, it's not nimshach to outside of himself, it's still inside himself. Leo's beget a makor, so to be called a makor for something else. No, it's not a makor for anything. It's still inside. It's in his machshava as he's thinking for himself, in himself, so to speak. As the teacher would be thinking about it in himself, for himself, but not yet thinking about it in terms of his talmidim and how he's going to give it over to the talmidim. But nevertheless, it's a tziyur mugbal of machshava. It's this machshava, not that machshava. Okay. So we continue. This is the hashor of the oil, not the hashor of the kalim. The hashor of the kalim is obviously a whole different ball game. The inyan of hashor of the kalim is mamish the inyan of gvul, because the kalim are the inyan of gvul. Masha Einkain, the inyan of hashor in the oil is a tzir in the or, but not necessarily a gvul in the or. The hashor is hakalim. That's the inyan of the Rala Sha'arim, which we'll get to in a later mimer. He's going to explain the scene of the Ralash Sharim, but and that has to do with Hashoras Akelim. But here it's Hashoras Oiros, and therefore it's a whole different gather in Hashora. It's only Hashora in and of himself, not Hashora of something outside of himself, so to speak. Therefore, Hara Eno Shaykh Loima Bazeh His Nasus Mihadavar Hamishabe. It's not misnase over something that will be created because it hasn't been created yet. Gimashuhu Merumam Lavado, in and of himself. But now we get to the second madrega. That's all the first madrega. Now the second madrega in the oir. We said again, the first madrega is the oir as it is in Malchus to Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum. Now we're talking about how the or is nimshach from Malchus to Ein Sof, but before it's hamelubashim keilim. Before we're talking about the sefiros hegenuzos. Now we're talking about the sefiros blima. In other words, blima hus bli geder, but nevertheless individuated in yonim, as we will see. Masha ein kain v'hamis nasa mimus oilam, hu ba'or kamoshu begiloi lihislabish bekeilim. But before it's melubash. Aval kodem shemislabish adai. Right? It's the or that's nimshach and mizgale, but not yet melubash. There's a two in yonim, his galus and his lapshus. His galus and his lapshus is a much greater tzimtzum than the Indian of his galus. Yes, there's a tzimtzum in order for something to be mizgale. The or that we're talking about now is after the tzimtzum. The sefiros is blima after the tzimtzum, but they're not yet melubashim keilim. It's nevertheless an or which is in some sense or another bligvul. Lagabe the or in the keilim, it's a bebchino bligvul, and therefore we call it blima. The bechinezu, ain't bechinas meruman levado. It's not called like the sefiros hegenuzos. It's not called meruman levado. One bechinas roimus atzmi. It's not roimus atzmi. Why? Because it's already in a state of giloi, and therefore it's outside of atzmus. It's the Indian of gilui. It's the source of the ohros of the sefiros. In other words, the ohros that are hamelubashim in the kelim of the sefiros. Nevertheless, even regarding this, it says, it is an inan of his nasus. But it's menusek in a comparative sense, right? It's lofty over and above yemos oilam. What's the yemos oilam? The sefiros. They're not yet melubashim keilim, therefore they're still poshut. Nevertheless, they're above the Yemois Oilam, which are the sefiros. Shein Yoimin Dezo, Dezer Anpin. These are the Indian Yemos Oilam, is the Indian of the Shisha, the Sheshes Yomim of Zer Anpin. As we know, the 7 days of the week correspond to the six sefiros of Zoh and the sefiros of Malchus. And the sefiros of Zoh are called Sheshes Yomim. They call this is called the 6 days. Malchus is called Yom Hashvi, but nevertheless, this or is still menusa from the sefiros of Zer Anpin of Atzilus. So again, menusim adayim v'chilis yemos oilam shein yoimin de Zer Anpin, the Zoh. The yoimin the sefiros d'atzilus bichlal, and the yoimin of the sefiros, all of the sefiros of not just the 7 sefiros, but all of the sefiros of atzilus are called yoimin in one sense or another. Why? Because they're gilo or, just as the day is a bechidas or. Kail havaya ve'yoer lanu. It's the union of gilo or. But derech klal yesh loimar the base bechidas elu. And now we could say that the first madrega and the second madrega, the sefiros hegenuzos and the sefiros blima, these 2 madregas that we just spoke about, the first 2 madregas here, bechinas eila, bechinas atik va'arich. We could say that they're the Indian of atik and arich, not really atik and arich of atzilus, but arich, atik and arich in a more kloliistic way. He'll say shortly that's atik and arich of of Adam Kadmoin. Adam Kadmoin is the world prior to atzilus, and it's an oilam kloli. It's not an oilam prati, like atzilus is an oilam prati. Masha Enken Ach is an olam kloli. It's a meta world, if you want to put it in that lotion. And that would be here the Atik and Arich that we're talking about, the two madregas of oil would be called Atik and Arich. In other words, Atik is the oil, really the Orient Sof Lamaila Mi'ak. It's the madrega of Atik is really Reishi Sakav, according to Zohar, Raki of the Arizal, and various other Sforim. But in any event, it is Lamaila the sefiros of Ak. It's called Atik of Ak. Masha Kain Arich. Arich was already much more of a tziyur. It's the second madreg in the oil. So we say this is Atik and Arich. Common is Baal El, Perik Tes Vav. The Esesfiris Agnuzos, these 10 Esesfiris Agnuzos, the sefiros that were in Malchus, the Ein Sof. Esesfiris Agnuzos, Hem Bechin is Atik the Ak. It's called Atik of Ak. And it's explained in various forms that it means ne'atak afilu mi'ak. It's ne'atak means it's separated afilu from ak because it's higher than even the meta world of ak. Va'or sheba begiloi la'achar hatzimtzum harizeh b'chinas arich bichlal. That's called the arich hakloli, right? Or arich bichlal. Arich hakloli, so that's atik hakloli, and this is arich hakloli. Dimi yoisoi b'chinas makol esesfiros, even though arich is a marker for Esos, just like the union of Keser is the marker for all the other spheres, Chochmah, Bina, and so on. Nevertheless, Keser is still on a different madrega from all of the other oiros. Chochmah is a koyach. Keser is not a koyach. Keser is a makif, right? It's the difference between makif and koyach. In any event, so it's mekom makom meruma menusa mehem from these other spheres. All of this that we're speaking about is the oiros b'chinas pshitos, the first two madregas in the oiros. The gamma madrega based on now who b'chinas pshitos. Even the second madrega, the madrega which is called arich of the in a general way, this is b'chinas pshitos and b'chinas blima. It doesn't have a mohus that we can describe. The imi yoisam madregas pratiyos, that even though the sefiros of the esespheros blima are sefiros pratiyos, harahem bechinas blima, nevertheless they without a character and without a mahus that we can readily identify. Mipnei shehatzimtzum bechinas miut lavad, because the tzimtzum there is not a tzimtzum, it's only an aspect of miut, and it's not an aspect of siluk. And therefore, the what happens as a result is not his gashmus and his labshus, but bechinas mute of the or, and the or therefore remains the bechinas bligvul in some sense or another, and therefore it's called bdima. Kmo chochmas timon, an example of this would be chochmas timon, shehi lamal mi chochma legabe chochma gluya. It's lamal mi chochma, ay chochma gluya, chochma of atzilus. Chochmas timon. Chochmas timon would be chochma of arich, right? So the esespheres blima are, for example, chochmas timon, and then we would say, I guess, binas timon and chesed timon and so on and so forth. All these sefiros that there are in arich, all the 10 sefiros of arich, will be bechinas timon or bechinas blima, as we have pointed out. And this could be compared to svoras harav, shu svora achas adayin. And it can be compared to the svora of the Rav, that the Rav is already ready to give over a concept to his Talmidim. And however each Talmid accepts the svora, some are going to accept it b'bechinas chesed, like Hillel, some are going to accept it b'bechinas gvura, like Shammai. But the svora in the svora of the Rav, both of these inyonim, chesed and gvura, are not yet manifested. In other words, that the way it is by the Rav, it transcends both chesed and gvura. It's on a higher madrega than both of them. It's svora achas adayin. It's not divided into chesed and gvura, into chiyuv and zakai, chayim and zakai, into asur and mutar, into tomei and tahor. It's not divided into those inyonim yet. That's all the first two madrigas in the oir, which he really started explaining in the previous chapter, and he just went into a little bit more over here. But now, Be'ika, we're getting to the third madriga in the oir. The third madriga in the oir, madriga hagimel, who are oirs of mislapshim b'keilim. These are the ohros as they are hamelubashim in the kalim. In other words, a much lower madrega than the other two ohros. The first ohr is the ohr as it is in Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum. The second ohr is his galus ohr after the Tzimtzum, but before his lapshus in kalim. And now we're talking about the third madrega, which is his lapshus in kalim. Sheboim b'bchinas tfisa v'his lapshus mamish. That these ohros coming to his lapshus in the kalim mamish be-kalim. Achenasin k'fi mehusa kalim, until the or becomes like the mahus of the kli. In other words, if the kli is a kli of chesed, then for sure the oyer is going to be the oyer that is melubash in the kli of chesed. Sheba'en aruch klal l'gabay or. It's not. It's ba'en aruch to the or before it has the tzir of the kli of chesed. Now, even though we said that there's a tzir in the or already, according to the Shita, there is already a tzir in the or itself, and it's not just the kalim that give it the tzir. Nevertheless, the tzir that the kalim give the or when the or becomes melumash in the kli is a much more metzumtzam kind of tzir. It's mamash gvul. So he's going to explain. Kumon ba'asoga the or haseichel shebemoyach lahasig hasoga gashmius. Like thinking about a davar gashmi. That it's not on the same madrega as a theoretical thought that has nothing to do with Gashmias. It's just not the same madrega. They might both be thought, but this is a thought makusham, and that's a thought. This is a thought of a, I don't know, a refrigerator, right? And that's a thought of something that's completely abstract, right? The concept of cold, for example, right? And like this is the svara of Shammai and Hillel, that Shammai and Hillel's asoga is b'chinas chesed gvura mamish. In other words, once it gets to the asoga of Shammai and Hillel, there it already has a definitive tziyur. We can say that this is the svara of Hillel and that's the svara of Shammai, right? In other words, they're two different svaras that come from the same or. The or can be melubash in the kalim of Hillel, in the seichel of Hillel, can be melubash in the kli. The same or can be melubash in the kli of Shammai, and it comes out in two different ofanim. Hillel brings out the. Did I say Hillel? I meant Hillel. Hillel brings out the chesed shebaoyer, and Shammai brings out the gvura shebaoyer. And so he goes on to explain. They have a definable content, so to speak. It's not only that the kalim cause the or to be a certain type of or, a blue kli causes the or to be blue, so to speak. In other words, a Shammai keli causes the or to be a or of gvura, and Hillel causes it to be an or of chesed. It's not only mitzad the kalim, the or itself is mulubash in those kalim because it's shaykh to those kalim. Kim shenazim b'chinas chesed gvura mamash b'chinas metzius in the kalim of Hillel and Shammai. In the kalim of Hillel and Shammai, it becomes mamash metzius or. It's not just that they have a color. There's an added sort of dimension to the or, which is called a color. They become mamash and metzius mamash. In other words, they become much more mugbal because of the hislapshus. Hislapshus causes hagbola and hagshoma. Hagshoma meaning causes the ors to become sort of materialized, so to speak. And to the extent that once the or is already in the mind of Hillel or in the mind of the svara of Shammai, in order for it to become a bechinas bittul v'iskalulus bahem, yosachlifu duchtayu, so that the or can change its place. I'll explain this in a minute. It can't happen by itself. There has to be a higher gilui that brings it into to change the kli that it's shaykh to. Now, let me just explain what in achlifu duchtayu is. Achlifu duchtayu literally means to change their places. But derech klal, the or of chesed is only going to go into the kli of chesed, and the or of gvura is only going to go into the kli of gvura. But we see, for example, with Hillel and Shammai, that on the odd occasion, Hillel is machmir and Shammai is mekil. In certain rare halachas, it works out like that, that Hillel is machmir and Shammai is mekil, the opposite of what you would think. Now, how does that happen? So in order for that to happen, he explains, that has to be through a giloy or elyon. In other words, it has to be back in the oil before the or is malubash in the seichel of Hillel and Shammai, back in that oil before it becomes differentiated into chesed and gvura. In that or, it could now be malubash in a different kind of a kli. Right? It could be malubash in the opposite kli. Instead of being malubash in the kli of chumrah, it can be malubash in the kli of kula, even though it's Shammai saying it, because it's a higher or it's an or elyon that's not yet differentiated completely into chesed and gvura. He's going to explain this Indian. Well, derech mashakaza hamshel upachad imoy oise shalmim roimov. All right, we'll go a little bit further. Va'enu mechamim zeh et zeh. Michoil shel sar shel mayim. Michoil is the sar shel mayim, and Gavriel is the sar shel eish. Va'enu mechamim zeh et zeh. They don't extinguish each other. In other words, they don't bother each other. How could it be that Michoil and Gavriel coexist? They're not mechaber zeh et zeh. Mishzeh on the day gilo ha'or elyon dafka. It's through the gilo or elyon, in other words, through the madrega of hamshel ufachad imoy, the Indian of rulership and awe, or fear and awe, is imoy im hakodesh baruch hu. When it's im hakodesh baruch hu, then it can come down in such a way that it's not one thing is not a stereo to the other. Shar shel eish, shar shel mayim, and not mechabim zeh et zeh. Va'en mechabim zeh et zeh. How does that happen? When it's an or elyon, then it's able to be noisesh hafochim without causing any pirud. The hamelubashim, as far as the malachim are concerned, hagam shehem bo'elam abriya. Malachim are there's different kinds of different madregas of malachim. There's malachim in olam abriya; those are generally called the srafim. There's malachim in Yetzirah; those are called generally chayos, and in malachim olam asiyah, those are called oifanim. That's b'derech the way it goes. There's even an Indian of malachim in olam atzilus called sichlim nibdolim, but they like sort of not the same category of malachim. In order to really be called a malach, the highest it goes is bria. But in any event, even though the malachim have their place, the malachim that are permanent malachim, like Michoel, Gavriel, Raphael, and so on, those are in Bria. The malachim that change from moment to moment are for sure in Olam Hasiya, and Afilu Olam Yetzira, those are malachim that are temporary malachim in general, right? They're malachim that have a certain shlichus, and they change from time to time. In Olam Hasiya, they change regularly and quite quickly. But the malachim and olam abriya are ständige malachim. They're permanent malachim, so to speak. The malachim of Mishashis Mebreshis. The malachim agam shehem bo'elam abriya. Nevertheless, shorshan hu mi'oris v'kelim da'atzilus. The shorish of the malachim mi'oris v'kelim da'atzilus. In other words, chesed da'atzilus, gvura da'atzilus. These are shoroshim of Michoel, chesed, and Gavriel, gvura. So from the oris and kelim da'atzilus. K'mosh kaz b'sefer shar kriya shma. Besidur, I'm sorry, not Besefer. Besidur, B'shar Kriya Shema. That's the Sidur and the Alter Rebbe Sidur, Sidur im Dach. Shar Kriya Shema. That's where it speaks about this Indian, where the Malachim come from. And it says, the Nefesh of the Malachim, Shorshan, the Nefesh of a Malach, in other words, the inner content of the Malach, not the outer form thereof, Shorshan me'oris da'atzilus, comes from the oris of Atzilus. V'yiskalus shalehem, or the ha'or elyon shalamala mishneim. And the iskalus of the two different disparate qualities, Michol, Gavriel, etc., is through an or elyon which transcends both of them. Oyse shalom bimroimav, hu yaseh shalom, right? He's the one that makes the shalom because it's a higher gilui than the malachim themselves. Shalom ali b'shneim. Shaladazim is battling with Sivusam, and therefore they can sort of coexist without any machloikas, so to speak. Similarly, in Atzilus, in the oiros that hamelubashim in the kalim shehem b'chinas chuk, chesed gvura. In order that they come to a bitul iskalus, so that they can be, for example, achlifu duchtayu, that's dafka all day or elyon dafka, only the or as it is beyond the kalim, transcending the kalim, can that then change, switch around the or, that the or can now come into a kli of gvura where it was previously in the kli of chesed, and a kli of chesed where it was previously the kli of gvura. Achlifu duchtayu. They're also connected to the Or Ein Sof through an Or Elyon, not as they are down below, because there's a bechinas mute, and they can only be connected on a higher madrega. They have to, so to speak, transcend their own qualities in order to be connected to this, to the Or Ein Sof. Dehine shorsh ha'oiros haklulim b'Or Ein Sof harim yuchadim be'etzem b'Or Ein Sof baruch hu. The oiros that are klulim are called oiros miyuchadim. In other words, the oiros that are in the Or Ein Sof before the tzimtzum are miyuchad. They're miyuchad, completely united over there, completely one inyan. Alpha P that we say that is sefiros. The gam b'chinas is galus shalahem, i.e. b'chinas sefiros blima. Gam b'chinas is galus shalahem. Kodim shemizlavshim kelim sheim b'chinas blima or blimahus. They're also bechinas is achtus. Now, when we say the bechinas is achtus, obviously the oiros, as they are in malchus the Ein Sof before the tzimtzum, are in a much higher level of achtus, yichudi ilah, as opposed to the achtus of the sefiros blima after the tzimtzum. That will only be a lower madrega of achtus, yichuda tato. Okay, so he explains. But the third madrega, when they're actually melubash in the kalim, even though they're still or hadavuk to the makor, because or if it's not davuk to the makor would no longer be or. If you cut off the sun from the ray of the sun just dies out sooner or later. It might take a short time, but it's a few minutes, and then the ray will be gone. Right, so there must be davuk to the makor, and or has to be davuk to a ma'or in order for it to be a ray of or. So it has to be davuk in one sense or another. But nevertheless, it's only davuk after it comes into his lapshus, and therefore it's mute, and it's not at vekus that's nikeret. It's not vekus that's recognizable. Okay, so we'll talk about that more later. So, or hadavuk b'makoira mitzad shehem b'chinas or be'etzem, and therefore it has to be davuk. Because it's or, it has to be davuk. There's no such thing as or that's not davuk, as I just mentioned. V'gam ken inyan shenizbar le'el perek yudalet of this sefer she'eses the oiros and b'chinas pshitus l'kamei eses the keilim. That the sefiros in the oiros, in other words, when you talk about the sefiros in the oiros only before the hamelubashim and the keilim, it's a completely different pshitus, a completely different level of simplicity or purity than it is legabe the kalim. When the or is already in kalim, that's when it's labshus and becomes into akshoma and so on, becomes more magusham, more materialized and so on. Mikom makom zeu al dagilu or elyon shepoel behem is aktus v'iskalulus. Nevertheless, even when the or is in the kalim, there's an or elyon. In other words, the mako where that or comes from. That's the or elyon that causes in them the inyan v'his achtus v'his kalulus, that or is in a state of achtus. We'll explain this now by way of Pasach Eliyahu. V'kamayim ant hu, you're the one the kashi loin miyached loin. You're the one that's makasher and miyached the oiros together. In other words, even when the oiros in kalim, that there's 10 differentiated oiros, 10 oiros mamash, hamelubashim kalim. How do they form a single unit. Antu the kashilon miyachedlon. You're the one that binds them together and miyached them together as a single entity. The kaila oiros hamislabshim bekalim. This is referring to the oiros that are already in the kalim. The iskashus v'izaktu shalahem orenzo baruchu v'chen hayichud v'izkalu shalahem al yed shalahem tochatzmam. In other words, the binding of those oiros to the Orient Sof, and those binding of the oiros one to another, that's iskalus shalohem, one to another. Who al yaday? How does it come about? Al yaday the antu the kashi. You're the one that makes that kesher. Without the antu, you're the one that's makasha them. There wouldn't be a concept of iskashus. They would be just separate oiros. But what? Mikoma koma dveikus vayichud ubechinas iu b'chayoichad liyoshizeh ubechinas ha'oyer. And this dveikus is an inyan of iu v'chayoichad. He and his chayus are one, not iu garmoi, which is a kalim, which is a much lower madrega. This is the inyan of yichuda ilah as opposed to yichuda tatah. It's a much higher madrega of achdus. Iu v'chayoi, chayoi means the oiros in this context. Chad or one liyoshizev uchinas ha'or. Since the or is always davuk to the ma'or, it has to be that way. Otherwise, it's not going to be or. Sorry, let's go from onto the kashilon. You're the one that binds them together. Why does it have to be that there's a higher or that binds them together? Because they're already in bechinas kalim. Lefisha nasi bechinas betzius kfi mehusa kalim. Walken dafka al day or elyon nasi behem a bitul. Only possibility of bitul in iskalulus is if there's an or elyon that illuminates those particular oiros, and then they can become an inyan of achdus, etc. All right, so the kitzur. Madrega alef hanal beginas merumam levadoi, beginas atik daak. That's the first madrega. Second madrega Beis who hamisnasim mos oilam, and that's beginas arich. In other words, mia mos oilam. It's a comparative. It's a much more comparative than the first madrega. It's misnase mia mos oilam. That's beginas arich. But called zeh who beginas blima. That even the second or is beginas blima. First or is hegenuzos. Madrega gimel, which is the ikar inyan of this particular parak. Madrega gimel haina oris mislabshim kalim. Those are the oris that are already in kalim, hamelubashim in kalim, and therefore bechinas miyud and bechinas symptom, etc. Shenasim ke'erech muhusa kalim, that they made like the oris become like the kalim. In other words, bechinas hagshoma, because of these labshus. וזהו אשר החליפו דוכתיו, וכן יזקשוס שלהם באור אינסוף, ויזקלו שלהם one with the other, who על ידי אור עליון המאיר עליהם ובהם. In order for there to be achlifu duchtayo, for the or to be in a kli that's the opposite of its nature, in other words, or a chesed b'kli agvura, or a gvura b'kli chesed, in order for that to happen, that's and also the possibility for the oris to be miskashrim as a single unit, even though they're completely opposite oris, chesed and gvura. Nevertheless, that can happen through or ein sof, not through or ein sof, through or elyon hameir aleihem ubahem, that illuminates them and is invested in them. Okay, I will stop here. This is the inyan of that was Perek Lamed. Be'ez Hashem, next week we will do Perek Lamed Aleph. Good.